You are walking through the dense brush of the savanna. The sun beats down intensely on your bare shoulders. The tall grass whips against your legs. You pull a stiff animal hide over your head to block the scorching rays, but the crude leather is heavy and awkward. Do you feel the coarse edge of the hide digging into your neck as you move? It smells of dry earth and old sweat. You tie it around your waist with a thick, unyielding vine. It is a clumsy solution to a persistent daily problem. The hide slips every time you reach up to pick fruit from the high branches. It gapes open when you bend down to dig for starchy roots in the hard soil. How many times a day do you have to stop and readjust this heavy, slipping skin just to function? Sharp thorns catch the loose, dangling edges. Biting insects find their way into the wide gaps near your chest and back. You are shielded from the worst of the sun, but you are trapped by your own crude garments. For hundreds of thousands of years, this frustrating struggle was your daily reality. You are a biological anomaly on this planet. You are a unique primate that has lost almost all of its protective body hair. You evolved this bare skin to survive the relentless heat of the open plains. You sweat through millions of pores to keep your brain cool while running after prey or escaping danger. Is this not a brilliant evolutionary strategy for regulating your internal temperature? But this incredible cooling system leaves your physical exterior entirely defenseless. You have no thick fur to block the dangerous ultraviolet radiation from the blazing sun. You have no natural armor against the scraping branches and razor-sharp grasses of the forest edge. You lack any inherent protection from the swarms of mosquitoes and ticks that carry debilitating diseases. You desperately need a physical barrier. You need a second skin that works with your body instead of against it. You try draping softer hides over your shoulders to cover your vulnerable flesh. You try pinning the slippery edges together with long, sharp acacia thorns. But the brittle thorns break easily under the tension of your movement. They slip right out of the tough leather as you walk through the brush. You try punching holes in the hide with a sharp piece of shattered stone. You use a primitive tool known as an awl. You force the stone all through the thick leather with all your strength. Have you ever tried to push a dull rock through a dried animal skin? Then you remove the stone and push a thick strip of animal tendon through the hole. It is an agonizingly slow and frustrating process. The holes you punch with the awl are always too large for the bindings. The garments you piece together this way are stiff and incredibly awkward to wear. They do not fit the natural contours of your body. Dr. Ian Gilligan, a prominent researcher at the University of Sydney, has dedicated his work to understanding this exact evolutionary dilemma. His extensive research reveals that the origins of complex clothing were not entirely about surviving freezing winter temperatures. Clothing was absolutely essential for protecting vulnerable, hairless human skin from the daily, mundane hazards of the environment. You needed garments that could flex and move dynamically with you. You needed clothing that fit tightly enough to keep parasitic insects out, but loosely enough to allow your vital sweat to evaporate. You needed tailored everyday wear. But tailored clothing requires precise, permanent, and tight seams. How can you create a tight seam without a tool designed specifically for that purpose? It requires a level of technological sophistication that you have not yet imagined. You sit under the dappled shade of a large acacia tree during the hottest part of the afternoon. You hold a thin, flat splinter of animal bone in your hand. You have spent hours meticulously grinding this bone against a rough piece of coarse sandstone. You have shaped it into a sharp, pointed awl for piercing hides. You use it to pierce a piece of soft, scraped antelope hide resting on your knee. You punch a hole through the pale leather. You pull the tool completely out of the material. You manually feed a stiff strip of plant fiber through the fresh hole. You do this repetitive motion over and over again until your fingers are raw. Your hands cramp from the awkward tension. The resulting seam is uneven, bulky, and inherently weak. You stop and stare at the blunt, flat end of the bone all resting in your palm. What if you did not have to remove the tool to feed the thread through the hide? What if the tool itself could carry the thread through the leather in one smooth action? It is a revolutionary thought that will change the course of human history. You are conceptualizing an eyelet for the very first time. You are imagining a way to combine the act of piercing and the act of threading into one continuous, fluid motion. This is a monumental cognitive leap for your species. It requires you to envision a negative space, an intentional void, inside a solid object. How do you carve a hole into a piece of bone so small? You pick up a sharp piece of fractured flint from the dirt. You carefully select a piece with a tiny, incredibly strong and sharp point. You press the sharp flint against the flat, blunt end of the bone splinter. You begin to twist the stone. You grind the stone point back and forth against the hard bone surface. It takes immense physical concentration and fine motor control. If you press too hard, the delicate bone will shatter into useless fragments. If you slip even a fraction of an inch, the razor-sharp flint will slice open your finger. You are deliberately drilling a microscopic hole. You drill patiently until you create a small, shallow depression on one side of the bone. Then you carefully flip the tiny splinter over in your hand. You align the flint borer with the exact same spot on the opposite side of the bone. Can you maintain the steady hand required to meet the hole perfectly in the middle? You twist and grind the stone point against the bone. The stone point finally breaks through the remaining layer of material. You have created a tiny, perfectly circular hole in the bone. You wipe the white bone dust away with your thumb. You are holding the world's first sewing needle. This specific technological breakthrough is clearly visible in the archaeological record of our ancestors. In the Denisova cave, nestled high in the Altai Mountains, researchers unearthed a perfectly preserved sewing needle. It was beautifully carved from the hollow bone of a large, unidentified bird. It had a clearly defined, perfectly circular eye drilled right into its base. While this specific ancient needle was discovered in a much cooler climate, the foundational technology it represents fundamentally altered everyday human life across all environments. It allowed for the creation of durable, fitted garments regardless of the daily weather conditions. But your beautiful new bone tool is completely useless without the right material to thread through it. You cannot force those thick, clumsy leather strips through this tiny, delicate eye. What natural material can you possibly use to bind your new clothes together? You need something incredibly fine and astonishingly strong. You look away from the dry dirt and stare at the tall, wild flax plants growing near the damp riverbank. You walk over to the water's edge and pull a large handful of the green stalks from the earth. You submerge these stalks in the shallow, stagnant water and leave them there for several days. This intentional soaking process rots away the soft, useless outer tissues of the plant structure. What remains hidden inside the stem are the long, tough, and highly resilient bast fibers. You extract these pale, stringy fibers from the muck and lay them out flat on a rock to dry in the hot sun. Have you ever considered the complex chemical and physical processes required to harvest plant fibers? Once the fibers are completely dry and brittle, you take a small bundle of them in your hand. You moisten the dry strands with a small amount of your own saliva. You begin to roll them vigorously against your bare thigh with the palm of your hand. The intense friction of your hand against your leg twists the short, individual fibers together. You add more loose fibers to the end of the growing strand. You keep twisting and rolling the material with a steady rhythm. You are spinning thread. You are taking weak, useless, individual strands of plant material and locking them together into a continuous, nearly unbreakable cord. Does this not require a profound, intuitive understanding of physics, tension, and friction? The undeniable evidence of this sophisticated early textile production was discovered deep in the Savanna cave in the modern nation of Georgia. Researchers analyzing microscopic soil samples found perfectly preserved ancient flax fibers dating back over 30,000 years. These were not just crude, accidental strings left on the cave floor. These microscopic fibers had been deliberately twisted, intricately spun, and even intentionally dyed using natural mineral pigments. Your ancestors were not just surviving, they were creating colored thread to sew their garments. You are not just making basic survival gear to block the sun. You are making conscious, aesthetic choices about how you look and present yourself to the world. You thread your new, sharp bone needle with the fine, strong flax string you just spun. You take 2 pieces of carefully prepared, thin antelope hide. You overlap the soft edges precisely where you want the seam to rest. You push the sharp point of the bone needle firmly through the double layer of leather. It passes through the material with surprisingly minimal resistance. The eye of the needle pulls the strong flax thread directly through the hole in the same motion. You pull the thread completely tight against the leather. You move a fraction of an inch down the edge and make another identical stitch. Do you see how perfectly the small holes match the exact size of the spun thread? There are absolutely no gaps in this seam. The seam you are creating is tight, highly secure, and functionally permanent. You sew multiple pieces of soft hide together to create a light, perfectly fitted tunic. It covers your vulnerable shoulders and chest entirely, protecting you completely from the blistering, relentless sun. It does not slip down your back when you break into a dead run across the plains. It does not fall off your shoulders when you climb the rough bark of a tall tree to harvest sweet fruit. You sew tightly fitted leggings that protect the sensitive skin of your legs from the tearing thorns and the biting ticks hidden in the tall savanna grass. You are actively building a custom, impenetrable barrier between your vulnerable human biology and the harsh, unforgiving reality of the natural world. How dramatically does this newfound physical protection change how you interact with your surrounding environment? But the invention of the sewing needle does something even more profound for your daily existence. It allows you to sew completely closed, three-dimensional shapes out of flat materials. You take a tough piece of thick leather and stitch the sides together perfectly tightly. You leave the top section entirely open. You attach a long, thickly braided strap of spun flax to the sides. You have just invented a highly durable, incredibly reliable carrying bag. This might seem like an overly simple, mundane creation to a modern mind. But the sudden ability to carry large quantities of items completely changes the trajectory of human evolution. Dr. Richard Lee, a renowned anthropologist who spent years studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, noted the absolute, critical necessity of carrying devices like the kaross. Without a sturdy bag, you can only forage exactly what you can hold in your two bare hands. You have to eat the gathered food immediately or return to your base camp constantly throughout the day. It severely limits your daily territorial range. It drastically limits your overall caloric intake and your ability to thrive. But with a tightly sewn bag slung comfortably over your shoulder, your entire world expands. Can you imagine the freedom of walking for miles without worrying about how to carry your resources? You can gather heavy nuts, starchy roots, and wild fruits all day long without stopping. You can carry enough surplus food back to the camp to feed your dependent children, your elderly relatives, and your injured community members. The tiny bone needle did not just physically clothe your vulnerable body. The needle directly allowed you to gather and transport a massive surplus of food. It allowed your ancient society to effectively support vulnerable members who could not physically forage for themselves. It is the silent, technological foundation of a complex, highly compassionate, and interdependent human community. You walk confidently through the hot savanna with your sturdy, hand-sewn bag resting easily against your hip. You are wearing a perfectly fitted tunic that breathes in the afternoon heat but strictly blocks the damaging sun. You move across the landscape with a totally new kind of physical and psychological freedom. You are no longer restricted by heavy, slipping hides that dictate your every movement. As you wear these tightly fitted custom garments every single day, they become a literal extension of your own skin. They become a deeply ingrained part of your personal identity and your physical presence. You quickly realize that the specific clothes you wear can silently communicate exactly who you are to others. You start to use your incredible bone needle for much more than just creating practical, utilitarian seams. You gather small, remarkably beautiful seashells from the distant coastline. You use your tiny flint borer to drill microscopic holes into the center of each delicate shell. You use your bone needle and the finest flax thread to carefully stitch these shells directly onto the collar of your leather tunic. Why would you spend hours of your precious time attaching useless stones to your clothing? At the famous Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists discovered tiny, perfectly pierced marine shell beads dating back over 70,000 years. These ancient shells show distinct, microscopic wear patterns indicating they were tightly strung together or carefully sewn directly onto clothing. Dr. Lucinda Backwell and other prominent researchers studying early bone tools universally recognize that this specific behavior is a massive cognitive milestone for humanity. You are using physical technology to create a complex symbolic language. You are intentionally decorating your everyday clothing to visibly broadcast your social status, your tribal group affiliation, and your personal hunting achievements. You sit comfortably around the warm evening fire with your extended family. The oppressive heat of the long day has finally broken. You pull your precious bone needle from a small, dedicated leather pouch tied at your waist. You closely inspect a small tear in your tunic caused by a sharp acacia branch earlier in the afternoon. You carefully and rhythmically stitch the tear completely closed. Next to you, your companion is diligently sewing a brand new bag specifically designed for gathering heavy roots. Someone else across the fire is meticulously attaching rows of carved bone beads to a ceremonial garment. Does sewing not naturally become a deeply shared, highly rhythmic social activity? It is a quiet, dedicated time for talking, planning tomorrow's hunt, and passing down vital survival knowledge. You patiently teach your young children exactly how to hold the sharp flint borer. You show them precisely how to apply exactly the right amount of downward pressure to the fragile bone without snapping it in half. You teach them how to identify the very best wild flax plants growing near the muddy riverbank. You show them the exact technique of rolling the wet fibers on their thighs to create the strongest possible thread. You are actively passing down an incredibly valuable technological legacy. The tiny piece of carved bone resting in your hand is easily the most valuable and transformative tool you own. It takes days of careful labor to make, but it lasts for years of constant, daily use. It dictates and shapes your daily life in fundamental ways you barely even notice anymore. Consider the modern clothes you are wearing at this exact moment. Look closely at the tight seams running down the side of your comfortable shirt. Look at the incredibly tight, even stitching holding the fabric of your pants together. Whether those millions of stitches were made by a high-speed, computerized machine in a massive modern factory or sewn slowly by hand by a master tailor, the core mechanical principle is exactly identical. A sharp, narrow point forcefully pierced the flexible material. A tiny, deliberately carved eyelet carried the strong thread directly through the gap. You are walking around today completely wrapped in the exact same technological breakthrough that your ancestors perfected tens of thousands of years ago. The vast savanna is still blisteringly hot, and the thorny brush is still incredibly dense. The sun still burns bare skin, and the insects still bite relentlessly. But you walk smoothly through the tall grass completely unbothered. You reach up high to pick sweet fruit, and your clothing moves perfectly and effortlessly with your body. You wake up when your body is ready, put on your garments, and face the environment on your own terms.